All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. It's always exciting to flip the switch on one of these events and see the groups who are joining us both live on camera as well as starting to join us live via YouTube. It's great to keep the learning going by broadcasting these events live into the homes of parents, of educators, and of students across North America. So today is going to be a great event. Today we are connecting with two pretty cool people joining us today, and they're going to tell us about an amazing expedition that they were on a remote island in Brazil. So we are going to meet Luiz Rocha today. He is with the California Academy of Sciences. He runs the Hope for Reefs initiative, and his team explores the depths of the ocean and the edge of coral reefs in a region known as the mesophotic zone. So we're going to learn a little bit more about that shortly. But basically, they're diving on these deep reefs using really cool dive technology, and they are classifying fish species, finding new species, and checking out what it's like in these ecosystems. And we're also joined today by Justin Grubb. Justin is a wildlife filmmaker, photographer, and published writer. He's also the co-founder of Running Wild Media, and his love for nature and passion for the outdoors has brought him to some of the most extreme habitats on the earth to film wildlife. So we've got an amazing group joining us live on YouTube. We've got more starting to join us live on camera today. Justin, I'm going to throw things to you. We're excited to learn a little bit more about this exciting expedition. And then, of course, we'll go crazy with a little Q&A time.
Awesome. Well, it's great to be here. I'm really excited to talk to all you guys and share some of the information that we learned on our trip and some of the things that we've done. Like Joe said, my name is Justin. I'm a wildlife filmmaker. Basically, what I specialize in is something called science communication. And it's a really cool field that kind of bridges the gap between the public and scientific organizations. And so what I really do is I go around and I go on expeditions all around the world to go film wildlife. So I've been on a lot of different really cool trips. We were out, filming red wolves in North Carolina, been out to Africa filming all kinds of cool animals out there to really kind of tell the story of what people are doing to help conserve these species. But most recently, I went on a trip to Fernando de Noronha in Brazil, and that's where I met Luiz and the California Academy of Sciences. They sent me on a really, really cool expedition to document what they were doing, to take photos, videos, write an article, and work on all kinds of really cool media to kind of tell their story so that people know what Hope for Reefs is doing to help save the coral reef ecosystem. So I just had an article come out in Oceanographic magazine about the work that Luiz was doing, and we are having a short video about Luiz and his work come out in Hakai magazine. That should be released, I want to say May 18th. So look out for that magazine, Hakai magazine. It'll be released online, and it'll show some really cool work that Luiz is doing. But I have some really cool photos and videos I want to share with you guys, but I'll let Luiz talk about what he does first so it makes sense. And then we'll introduce Fernando de Noronha. So
thanks, Justin. Thanks for having me. Great. I love talking to kids about what I do. So I am a marine biologist. I study fishes, more specifically fishes that live on coral reefs. And for that, I travel all over the world to warm locations to study my fish. I grew up, this particular expedition that we're going to be talking about is very interesting to me, particularly in a personal level, because it's an island that is on my home country, Fernando de Noronha. Not only that, it's also one of the first places that I visited as a marine biologist. And even before I went to college, I went there for diving. I've always been in love with the ocean and with diving and with marine science, even before when I knew that you could make a profession out of it. So I was probably younger than some of you in this call when I decided I wanted to be a marine biologist. I was in third grade, and my science teacher told me, "Oh, you really like fish, huh? You should be a biologist." And I'm like, "Yeah, I like that idea." So I became a biologist, grew up in Brazil, and I visited Noronha many, many times. And then I've been here in the US for more than 20 years now, and I had the chance to go back to Fernando de Noronha and see it again after 20 years or so being there for the last time. So super exciting, and looking forward to many interesting questions. I have all of the pictures we took there, so I can share my screen and show you some pictures at some point too.
All right, that sounds good. Justin, do you want to start with a little media from your end, or should we start off with Luiz? All right, you're on, Luiz.
All right, so as we talked about at the beginning, let me pull up the photos here. As we talked about at the beginning, the part of the reefs that I'm studying right now is called mesophotic reefs, and it's a funny name, but don't let that distract you. It just means that it's a relatively deeper portion of the coral reef. So if you saw a cartoon about coral reefs, or Finding Nemo, for example, where that starts in a coral reef, all of that colorful, brightly lit area of the coral reef is what most people study. Is the very shallow coral reef. But coral reefs extend a little bit deeper than that, and that's the areas that we study. So I'll show you pictures of what that looks like. Let me see if that works. All right. So you should be seeing my Lightroom. Are you seeing my Lightroom screen now?
Yep.
Okay, so that picture I took at about 160 feet depth. That's a dive that Justin did too. So it's the start of that mesophotic zone. It starts at about 150, 156 feet depth, and then it goes down. It goes down deeper than that. So let me pull up another picture here of a different dive that I did that went a little bit deeper. And the deeper we go, the stranger, the craziest things we started seeing. So this is at about 300 feet depth, and it's a species of grouper that's very common in Fernando de Noronha, in the island we went. And the deeper you go, the more common it gets. So it particularly likes those deeper reefs. And that was one of the things that we first wanted to study, was if the fish that we find in the deep reefs are the same as the ones that we find in the shallow reefs. And more we're seeing that they're not, that those fish are different. And that's kind of after you understand what is going on there, you realize that it's not really unexpected, because those deeper reefs are colder, they're darker. So obviously the species that live there are not going to be the same as the ones that live in the shallow reef that are brighter and warmer. It's a different environment, a different habitat. So different species like the different conditions, and they kind of sort differently in the different areas. Do you want to jump in with something there, Justin? Switch out.
So yeah, going off of what he said, I met up with the team in a place called Fernando de Noronha, and it's a really, really small island about 200 miles off the coast of Brazil. And it's a really, really amazing place. Like, I was absolutely astonished with the beauty of the island and the wildlife and everything that was there. And Luis had this rating for all of the beaches around the island that when we would drive by one, he'd be like, oh yeah, that's number 2. Oh yeah, that's number 4. And like, these ratings were very competitive with ratings all around the world of beaches. So I'm going to show you guys some of the media that I grabbed of the island and of some of the wildlife that we saw there. And like I mentioned, I was there filming with the team and everybody. So these are like the cliffs that you would see on the island. The island was all just volcanic cliffs because it had a very violent volcanic past. And so you'll just be driving around and just see these big cliffs full of frigate birds and tropic birds and all kinds of really cool stuff. Amazing tide pools with all kinds of cool animals and fish and stuff living in them. Everywhere you looked, it kind of looked like this, you know. It was very raggedy rock, really cool water. That's an iconic feature on the island, that big pinnacle rock that's stuck up. And the wildlife there was also really incredible. there were all sorts of fish species, turtle species. This was an octopus that I had found while I was out there snorkeling. There were sea turtles everywhere. There were sharks. It was actually amazing the amount of wildlife that you could see off the coast. And you know, the ecosystem there, there was a lot of algae, there was a lot of plants and stuff that kind of dominated the rock space. But once you got down into that mesophotic reef, then you would start seeing a lot of the coral species and small reef fish as well. But the island is protected, and therefore there isn't an abundance of fishing. It's also kind of interesting that they limit the number of people that are allowed on the island. And so they try to keep the impact of tourism relatively low, and that actually helps protect the ecosystem and the wildlife and species that are found around the island. So these are just kind of my favorite shots of when I was diving, just specifically of wildlife. And I'll show you some shots of the team and everybody as we were doing some of the research and as they were diving. I am not certified to the level of scuba diving that Luis is, which I'm sad about. One day I'll hope to get that. But I took some photos of what they look like underwater, and it's insane. Like, normal people put on scuba gear and they're like, wow, this is uncomfortable. This is super limiting. But then you watch these guys put their scuba gear on, and it's like, oh no, they don't need just one tank. They need 4 tanks, and they need a filter, and they need a rebreather system, and they just have all kinds of crazy equipment. So it's kind of interesting to see how all that went. But you know, they put a lot of work in on the top of the ship to make sure that all of their equipment was good to go and they were ready to go on their dive. But I would basically just kind of meet them on their way down, meet them on their way up. And then I hung out with the shallow water team a lot of the time because they were doing genetic work on the species that they were collecting in the more shallow areas around the island. I got some footage of the divers while they were doing some work down on one of their sites. So one of the guys, I believe that is, yeah, that's Tyler. They will do like species abundance. So they'll look at like how many species that they're seeing. They'll also do percent coral cover. Luis takes a lot of really good photos, so I'm sure he'll show you more of those later on. But then they'll also collect species in order to do genetic work. So that allows them to determine if a species is new in the area or if it's a new record of the area. It basically just gives them, like, you know, a good working genome of what animals are there and how to protect them. And this is all very important to allow them to protect these areas, because if you don't know about the area, it's hard to determine the best way to protect it. So this is a really good way to do that. And I think that's why I'm so inspired by what Hope for Reefs does, is they go out and they collect this data and then they make it available for people who, you know, it's important to, who need to know about the reefs in their area. And it's a very important thing. And they've actually established 2 marine protected areas in some of the areas that they've been working. So I don't know, you'd switch back to Luis now if you want, so you can kind of elaborate more on what I just talked about.
Yeah, Luis, definitely come back to us. You know, I'm a diver as well, and my deepest dive is 155 feet, which looks like it's nothing compared to what you were getting at. So can you tell us about some of the depths you were working at and how long you were able to stay at depths?
Yeah, so that depth that you just mentioned there, 155 feet or so, that's the typical deepest dive of your normal scuba diver with 1 tank and no mixed gas, just breathing air. For us, because we need to go deeper, we need to use all of that equipment that Justin showed the photo of, and the objective is to explore those reefs between 150 and 500 feet. So my deepest dive is 506 feet. And it requires not only all of that equipment, but complicated mixed gas. Air becomes toxic if you breathe it at depth, at the depths that we go to at 300, 400, 500 feet. So we have to take out some of the air and add helium. So we're breathing a high concentration, a high proportion of helium at those depths so that we don't get sick, basically. And because it's so complicated, because it requires so much equipment, because it requires so much training, those reefs, they kind of remained unstudied. There's a lot to be understood. There's a lot to be known about those reefs. So much so that in Noronha, for example, Justin just said that one of the reasons why we see a lot of wildlife there is because there is a marine park. Almost the entire island is protected. About 75% of the reefs in the shallow waters are protected. They are within this marine park, which is a really good marine park. Let me see if I can pull out a photo with a lot of big fish here. That allows us to see kind of those big fish everywhere that we don't see almost anywhere else we go because they're fished. So just to give you one example, I'll show you a big photo of a big snapper here. Share my screen again. There you go. So that's one of the snappers that's very common there in the shallow waters, and we almost don't see it anywhere else in shallow reefs in Brazil because they're fished out. They're very good eating fish. But because nobody knew about those deeper reefs, nobody knew what was there, nobody knew if they were rich in species or not, they're not included in this marine protected area. So one of the main objectives of our expedition there was to document the diversity of species on those deeper reefs and kind of make the case to include at least some of them inside the marine park.
All right. So the initiative, the Hopes for Reefs initiative, looks like an amazing project, obviously diving in places that few people get to see. It looks like you've discovered several new species of fish. How did this project come to be in the first place?
Right, so we are 4.5 years into this 5-year project, and it has several different, multiple kind of objectives in it. One of them is it's exploration, it's discovering, it's trying to understand those really unknown deeper and shallow reefs. There's some shallow reefs that are not very well known either because they're in really isolated areas, remote places. So we try to understand what's going on in those shallow reefs too. Another big component of the Hope for Reefs initiative is trying to gather more information to help corals. The corals, a lot of people know that they are suffering a lot with climate change. So the corals, they live in this really tight association with algae. And when the water gets warm, they expel the algae that's within them, and that's really bad for them. So one of the things we try to do in the lab and in the field is trying to understand ways to avoid that from happening, to stop that from happening, to give corals a little bit more time. So the Hope for Reefs initiative in general is this, my dog is drinking water here, I bet everybody's hearing that, is the combination of this coral reef restoration, coral reef conservation, trying to increase the coverage of meaningful marine protected areas, important marine protected areas, and also exploration and looking at unknown biodiversity and trying to get as much information as possible to try to save the oceans, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's amazing work. And it really just goes to show, when people say there's nothing left to explore or discover on our planet, how wrong they are, and how we're just barely scratching the surface of our oceans, how much there is we don't understand, and how much there is left to explore. So Justin, you do a pretty important job, which is take the work that the scientists are doing, collect the media, and then get it out to the public. When did you know that this was your calling, what you wanted to do?
Well, I mean, I started off as a scientist. So I went to school, I studied biology, I got a specialization in marine and aquatic science. And then I started getting my master's in geospatial science. But while I was serving as a wetland ecologist, I studied turtles and snakes and mesopredators and animals found within the Great Lakes region. I would always take out a camera with me, and I would take out equipment that I would be able to record noises and things out in the forest and wetlands and flooded areas. And I would bring that back, and I would make little videos, or I would, publish photos or write blogs or articles, and really talk to people about some of the stuff that I was finding while I was out in the field. And I really, really enjoyed that, actually. I really enjoyed being able to interact with the public, answer their questions, tell them about the stuff that I was doing, tell them about the research and how it applies to them and what they can do to help the animals that I'm seeing. And that kind of like really sparked my interest into kind of specializing in this science, communication, education type career field versus being in the sciences. Like, I absolutely love being a scientist and I love working with scientists, but I just like having that creative outlet where I could use some of my other hobbies and talents to be able to support a lot of that work. And so at this field, I think is extremely important because, you know, if someone is working on a project that is not communicated to the public, who, you know, is the reason why this work is most likely being done, it's not doing a good service. So it has to be communicated to the public so people know what to do or how to act. And I think that's kind of a deficiency that we're seeing played out nowadays, where there's not good science communication and people are not aware of what's actually happening and how things work and how the scientific method can be applied. So that's something that motivates me, and that's kind of what caused us to create a production company that specializes with just working with scientists and conservation organizations to help get their message out there and help create education programs and social media marketing and all that good stuff. Because conservation is a people problem. Like, you gotta talk to people, you gotta educate people, you gotta work with people in order to be successful. And that's kind of where I like to live now.
All right, awesome. Well, to any students tuning in, you know, science may not be your strongest subject, but you may love media and art and photography and such, writing. So, you know, there is a way to combine those two passions, the science with the creating the media. And so science communication is a really exciting career. And I think we're going to see it becoming more and more popular over the next few years. So Justin and Luis, I think it's time that we jump to a little Q&A action, because we've got a great group joining us from across North America. Just a few shout outs in the YouTube. We've got 6th grade social studies group joining us in Michigan. We've got 3rd graders joining us from Spruce Grove, Alberta. Let's see. We've got APL Marine Bio and Environmental Science group joining us. And then also on camera, we have groups joining us from Pennsylvania, Alaska, Seattle, California. So it's great to have such a mixed group joining us. I'm going to start off with a question from YouTube right now. And this question is about bioluminescence. So we hear about bioluminescence, especially in the deep sea, but at the mesophotic level, is there bioluminescence? Have you documented species with bioluminescence?
Yes, and in this particular trip, we collected one species that does it. But there's this general thought that bioluminescence is really common in the deep sea, and it is, but it's also something that we see in the depths that we dive to.
All right, and what species was that, Luis? Was it a fish?
Yeah, it was a little deep sea fish. I don't think I have a photo of it. Let me see if I have a photo of it. It's gonna take a while because I don't know if it's an interesting question. I didn't expect to getting it. I didn't take a picture with my camera, but I know somebody sent me over email. I might be able to find it. So yeah. Let me just say something though about bioluminescence. It's interesting. In most cases, bioluminescence is not produced by the organism that is having the color. It's something else usually. And in fish, most of the time, it's like that. It's not the fish that produces the light. It's a bacteria that lives inside an organ in the fish that produces the light. I'll keep looking for that photo, and if I find it, I'll share it when I do.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. We've got Zoe in Indiana joining us. I'm going to turn her microphone on. Hey, Zoe.
Hi. My mom and I were wondering how the air makes you sick at deeper levels. So why you have to breathe helium.
So that's a question that it could take me like 2 hours to answer, or but I'll try to do it quicker than that. It's basically the way that the gases in the air get diffused into your tissues. They react in different ways with your body. And the atmosphere is mostly nitrogen. So a lot of people think that air is only oxygen. It's not. Oxygen is what we use when we breathe, but most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. So about 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, 20% is oxygen, and then there's a tiny little fraction of all of the other gases, including helium. Oxygen is what we use to breathe, but we don't breathe all of it. So when we inhale, we exhale also a lot of oxygen. And that mixture of nitrogen and oxygen, it works fine for us to breathe at this depth, at the pressure that we are here in the atmosphere at sea level. But the deeper you go, the more pressurized that gas gets, so the more condensed the gas gets. And then when nitrogen and oxygen go into your tissue, if there's too much of it that goes in the case of nitrogen, it makes you drunk. So it makes you feel like you're drinking alcohol. And in oxygen, the more you get under pressure, the more it gets to a certain depth. At about 200 feet, it becomes toxic. So it can give you seizures. It can give you visual hallucinations. It can give you you can start hearing things. So you don't want that because of the interactions between the gases and in your cells. So we have to take out those gases and put what we call an inert gas. So an inert gas is a gas that doesn't interact with your cells, with your body, the same way that oxygen and helium and nitrogen do. And that inert gas, in this case, is helium. So helium, because it doesn't interact with your body, it doesn't have those consequences. Now, what's super interesting is because we have to remove the oxygen and the nitrogen, we can't breathe with the gas that we put in the tank, we can't breathe it in the surface because there's not enough oxygen in there. So if we breathe that in the surface, we pass out. So we have to add oxygen when we breathe in the surface, and the deeper we go, the less oxygen we add. So that's a very complicated operation. And I could go talking about this for hours. But yeah, so that to avoid that interaction, the bad interaction of the oxygen and the nitrogen with your body, you remove them, and then you add a gas that doesn't do that, that doesn't have those interactions, which in this case is helium.
All right, that was an awesome explanation for a short period of time. That was good, perfect. Miss Carton's joining us in Alaska, and some of her students are tuning in as well. How you doing, Miss Carton?
Fantastic.
Who's joining you today?
Yes.
Does the behavior of creatures change the deeper you go in the ocean?
Sorry, what was the question again? I didn't cut the video cut off for me.
Does the behavior of creatures change the deeper you go in the ocean?
If the behavior of the creatures change, it does. It does. There's a few animals that go deep and shallow, and in general, the deeper they go, because the water is colder and it's darker, they tend to move slower. So if you're diving on a really shallow reef, everything kind of moves fast and it looks like a little bit frantic. And the deeper you go, the more slowly, the more mellow the things seem to be, and the slower they move. I think that's the biggest difference I see.
All right, very cool. So we're going to jump to YouTube and grab a question from there. Let's see. This one is from Aaron, and maybe both of you can answer this question. Aaron's wondering, you've obviously been on expeditions around the world. What was one of your favorite places to visit and dive? Maybe Justin, you start us off this time.
Okay, I'll try. That's a tough one. I'm sure Luiz will have problems answering that one too, because like I feel like everywhere I go and dive is such an amazing, incredible experience, and there's always something new to see. But I would say one of the places that I've gone diving the most is in Honduras along the Mesoamerican Reef. They have a really, really cool reef there, and I've done some video work there, some 360-degree video work there. And every time I go out, every dive, I always see a hawksbill sea turtle or a green sea turtle or a Caribbean reef shark or something. So the diversity, of the megafauna looks really good, but also, the corals still look pretty good there. I mean, I've been diving in Hawaii and Florida Keys and on American Samoa and the Marianas, and I've seen a significant amount of coral bleaching, but it looks like in the Bay Islands and Honduras, those reefs generally look okay. I mean, you still have some decent coral cover, and there's a place right off the coast of Roatan called Cordelia Banks, and it's got the most staghorn and elkhorn coral of any reef in the Caribbean, which is pretty incredible. It's like a huge field of just hard staghorn coral and elkhorn coral, and that's almost unheard of now in the Florida Keys and elsewhere in the Mesoamerican Reef. So that's a place I really love, but I really want to get into the Garden of the Queen in Cuba. That's a place I really want to go diving. But as far as I know, it's still only open for researchers.
All right.
Yeah, the Garden of the Queen is a place that I haven't been to either, and I really want to. But it's supposed to be one of the best reefs in the Caribbean. I'm going to try to answer this in a different way. I'm not going to tell you what my favorite dive site is because I don't have one, but I think one of the most interesting dives that I've done, and I know that the teachers will know that, but probably the students won't know it, was in Bikini Atoll. Bikini Atoll is a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific where the US military did a lot of nuclear tests. So they exploded those humongously big bombs that destroyed half of the island at a time. So they made dozens and dozens of those tests about 50 or 60 years ago. And that was really bad for the reef at the time. I mean, if you think about it, a big bomb exploding, it just destroys the whole reef and kills a lot of fish. But then, because those are all nuclear bombs, it left a waste behind. It had left radiation behind. So after the tests were done, everybody left the island and nobody could come back to the island. And even now, there's very few people living there, only 10 or 15 people at a time. Nobody can fish there because people are still afraid that there's effects of this waste, the radiation that stay there, it's still affecting the fish. So nobody fishes there. And when I dove there about 10 years ago, what I saw was spectacular. The reef was one of the most beautiful reefs I've ever seen. And it just shows you that even when you blast dozens and dozens of the biggest bombs you can think of and completely destroy the reef, if you leave it alone for a certain period of time, nature comes back. It can rebuild itself, it rebuilds the reef, all the fish come back. So all we need to do is kind of leave it alone and protect it, and it will come back.
All right. Well, that's pretty incredible. Both the resilience of nature and getting to dive in a spot like that. That must have been something. Let's see. Mr. Mede Travis, I believe, is joining us in Seattle. His class is tuning in, and I believe there's a question for us.
Yeah, my student Piper is wondering if you're interested in a career in science communication and specifically science communication and writing, what are some good things to study in college?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Honestly, I kind of went about it at a different route. I studied the science and everything. I think that gives me a huge advantage when doing science communication, being able to, read through a 50-page research paper and not want to like knock myself out, and being able to say, okay, this is what that was about. This is what they came up with, and translate that into a creative outlet. So my recommendation would be to, study some sort of science. It could be really anything, but also take advantage of some of the creative outlets. Like, you don't necessarily have to take, if you're into creative writing, you don't have to take a bunch of creative writing classes. There are clubs and stuff that are available to learn how to do that. Or if you want to learn photography, you don't necessarily have to take a photography class. You could just join a photography club, and learn from your peers. And that's kind of how I did it. I studied biology, I did research, I wrote papers. I was very focused on that. But on the side, I would do clubs and organizations and hang out with creative people who were making videos and photos. And that's where I learned how to sort of, make my hobbies and my interests more proficient. Because I was always taking photos and I was always playing around with writing and stuff. But I've never taken a video class or a film class or a photography class or anything. I have, learned what I've learned by working with people and learning from my peers and seeing what other people are doing, and just kind of learning passively as I focused on the content. And I think that gives you a unique perspective when doing science communication, that if you know the content well, then you have an easier time expressing that to a broader audience.
All right, very cool. Mrs. Gotowski is joining us with her family in California. If you don't mind unmuting for me, it's just not cooperating on my end. And then we'll grab a question.
Definitely.
There you go.
You guys have a question? No? I guess they don't have a question here. Well, thank you.
No, that's okay. Raise your hand, the little blue hand, if you want me to come back. Declan has raised his little blue hand. Let me unmute. Declan, are you in Alaska?
Oh, I am.
Excellent. You look comfy, Declan.
I am very hungry. So it's a question for Luiz. So I saw in one of his pictures that he has multiple tanks. How do you switch the tanks like when you're underwater?
That's a really good question. And as I said, some of the mixes in those tanks, if I breathe them too shallow, I won't have enough oxygen. So it's, if you breathe from the wrong tank, it's really a bad thing, and we can't do that. But for us specifically, so one of the ways we do it, can you pull up that picture again, Justin? I don't have any pictures because I'm always with the camera, so I don't take pictures of myself. But if you see, Justin is going to share right now. Let me see if I can see it on his picture. Yeah, so you see that number there, 70 on the side of the tank? That is the shallowest, actually that is the deepest depth I can breathe from that tank. So I can't breathe that tank deeper than 70 feet. And then the one right below that says 300. I can't breathe that tank deeper than 300 feet. And the one on the back there is, if I'm not mistaken, is the 190 feet tank. So I can't breathe that tank from the 190 feet. So it sounds complicated and complex, but in this case, all of those tanks there are only, we'd never breathe them if everything goes right. So they're only emergency tanks. So it's in case if the rebreather fails, then we have those tanks to go to. So we always breathe from the rebreather, which is what we have in our mouth right now. So it's that little trachea looking thing that goes in and out of the mouth. If everything goes right during the dive, we only breathe from the rebreather, and we only switch to those tanks if there's something wrong with the rebreather. Now, one of the tricks that we do is every time we get to the depth of the next tank, so when you saw those pictures there of Tyler and Bart with the 70-foot tank on the top, that means that we are at 70 feet or shallower. So always the tank that's closest to us is the one that we can breathe from. So wherever we get to 300 feet, we put the 300-foot tank on the top. And then when we get to 70 feet, we switch. We put the 70 feet on the top and then the 300 on the bottom, so that we know that always the tank that's closest to us is the one that we breathe from. But in general, knock on wood here, we never need to breathe out of those tanks. We always breathe from the rebreather, and the tanks are there just as an emergency, just as a precaution.
All right, great question, Declan. Mrs. Gastiger is joining us. Her students are in Pennsylvania. Let me pop that microphone on. Do you have any questions for us from your students?
Yeah, my student, Lydia, wants to know if there have been any new marine animal discoveries lately.
Yeah, yeah, several new species, including in this trip into Fernando de Noronha. Let me see if I can share something here. So we always, on average, we always discover at least 2 or 3 new species on those trips. One of the recent ones that we described was this one that I'm going to share right now. Let me see if I can. I'm just going to pull up the specific. There we go. This is a good one. One example. Hang on. Let me go back to Zoom here and try to share this window. Share screen. Let's see which one is. I have too much stuff open in my computer. All right, I have to separate this. Yeah, so as I said, because almost no scientists go to those depths, every time we do go, we find new species. Can you see it?
Yep. So
you're seeing the Wakanda fish up there?
Yep.
So this one we named after Wakanda. So we try to do, Wakanda is that town from Black Panther, from the Black Panther movie. we try not only to have like little creative things going with taxonomy. In addition to discovering these new species, we try to give them scientific names that have some sort of meaning that attracts public attention to, because the more attention these species get, the more attention they get, the easier it is to protect them. The more the media talks about them, the easier it is to protect them.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out too, Luis said, it's not just a process usually of just, haha, that's the new species. Sometimes it can take years before you can definitively say this is a new species after different groups have taken a look and comparisons have been made and such.
Right, right. So this one, the Wakanda fish, we discovered in Tanzania in Africa. And the description with the name came out about a year after we discovered it. So there's a whole process. We have to formally describe it. We have to put it a scientific name. We have to make a scientific paper about it. Then we have to submit to a scientific journal. It has to be reviewed by other scientists. And then when it's finally published, we get to talk about it in this way in the media that we did about this fish here. So that's why I'm not showing you any from Fernando de Noronha, because the descriptions are still in process. That trip was only 6 months ago. We're still writing the papers. We haven't even submitted them yet. And sometimes it's dangerous to show the pictures because it might be somebody else go there and then get the fish and tries to describe it, race it, doesn't describe it ahead of us.
All right, sneaky. Great question here online from Jennifer. And Jennifer's wondering, we hear about coral bleaching at shallower depths, but is it affecting the deeper reefs in the mesophotic?
Great question. Yes, it is. So that was the other, there's two things about the mesophotic reef that were kind of common between scientists before we started doing this work. The two things are that, one, a lot of people thought that they were the same species, shallow and deep. And two, a lot of people thought that because these reefs were deeper, the impacts, both natural and human impacts, would not reach those species. So people thought in general that those deeper reefs were a refuge for the shallow species. Now, the more we study them, the more we're seeing that those two things are wrong. First, all of the species are different. And second, a lot of the impacts to shallow reefs are also reaching those deeper reefs, including bleaching. So we do see bleaching on those depths. Even though it's different species of coral, they also bleach. And even though the water is colder, it's not the temperature itself that is making the corals bleach. It's the variation in the temperature. So if you think of a coral that's used to 80 degrees water, when the water goes up to 82, it bleaches. It's the same thing for a coral that is used to 70 degrees water. If the water goes to 72 or 74, it bleaches. So it's warming. It's also warming on the deeper reefs, and it's also causing bleaching for the deeper corals.
All right, a few more shout outs. We have Brian tuning in North Bay. We've got Landown High School in Virginia Beach. We've got Peterborough, Ontario. So great to see so many groups joining us today. Let's take another live question this time. So I see Zoe has her hand up again. All right, Zoe, what you got?
So you mentioned Bikini Atoll, is that how you say it? And we were wondering if you found genetic variations because of the radiation.
That is a great question. It's actually what I went there to do. When I did the expedition there, we wanted to sample the sharks to try to figure out if there was any lingering effect from the radiation. And I spent about 2 weeks there, and unfortunately, I couldn't sample a single one of the species that I wanted to sample because I was there in this gigantic private yacht that belonged to a multi-millionaire guy, the guy that co-founded Microsoft. And when I was about to start sampling the reef, he decided to join. He thought the mission was so interesting that he wanted to see for himself. He wanted to figure out, he wanted to kind of look at what we were doing. But because it was his ship, when he joined, we had to stop everything that we were doing, and every resource in the ship had to be at his disposal. So we didn't have as much time for sampling as we thought we would have, and we didn't sample the species we wanted to sample for the genetic tests. So we never did the tests. So I have to go back there and then sample them to be able to answer the question. But in short, I think there was some effect. in one of the species of shark, but we didn't sample it. So I have to go back and sample it to make sure it did.
All right. Ms. Carton in Alaska, your microphone's on.
So we are curious, with yesterday being Earth Day, what are you finding are the largest impacts from humans on the oceans in Brazil?
That's another good one. I think the impacts in Brazil in specific are the same impacts that we're seeing elsewhere in the oceans. Until about 10 or 15 years ago, I would tell you that the biggest impacts are overfishing, so too much fishing, pollution, just destruction of habitats, people doing landfills and creating artificial islands and destroying habitats in the process. But now for coral reefs in specific, the biggest threat is climate change. It's the increasing ocean temperature that is killing all of the corals, which are the ones that build the ecosystem. So we have these both kind of global level threats and local level threats. And at the global level, climate change is the biggest threat by far to all ocean ecosystems, but to coral reefs in specific. And at the local level, there's overfishing, there's pollution, there's sedimentation. So when you take down a forest that is close to the coast, the trees, the roots of the trees, the way they form that web over the sand, they keep that sand close to them. So when you take the trees down, there's no holding that sand anymore. That sand washes up to the reef and it covers the corals. So that's really bad for the corals. It's not just the pollution from the sewers, it's also pollution from land to sea when you take down a forest. So there's a lot of local threats. Plastics is a big threat for coral reefs today, but the biggest one of all, in a global level, is climate change.
All right, and we're gonna open the mic up one more time. Ms. Gas Tiger in Pennsylvania, do you have a question from one of your students?
My students are interested in all your career. How many coral reefs have you studied, you personally?
I do not know. I don't think I counted. I know I have been to more than 100 countries, but I don't know how many. I made more. I've done about 70 or 80 expeditions. My family knows very well. They're sitting there eating right now. I travel all the time. I try not to stay more than 2 or 3 weeks in the field at a time, just so I'm not away from home for too long. But I would say I have been to coral reefs in all of the tropical oceans. Yeah, all of the big coral reef regions in the world I've seen. One of the few places I have not is Cuba, like Justin mentioned there. And I really want to go, but I've been to several other places in the Caribbean. The Caribbean is where I started working, in Brazil. And I've been to many, many remote islands, from Easter Island to the Northwest Hawaiian Islands to the Marshall Islands, several places, Indonesia, the Philippines, you name it. So yeah, I've been all over the place.
What about you, Justin? What reefs have you been able to explore?
I stick around the Caribbean a lot. I've been diving in, throughout Mesoamerican Reef. I think that's just because it's the closest to us, and it's a really, really cool reef. And I'm just really fascinated with the types of corals and stuff that are there. But I've been diving, off the southern tip of Africa and Mozambique. I've been diving in the Pacific, in like American Samoa, Hawaii, the Marianas Islands, Guam, Saipan. I haven't really been diving much in like the Coral Triangle. That's a place that I really, really want to go. And the place that I want to go is Raja Ampat in Indonesia. I really want to see the coral reef there, as well as a lot of the reefs that are along the Philippines. So I have a lot of diving I need to do and a lot of ocean exploring I need to do. I keep getting sidetracked with these like megafauna projects on terrestrial mammals and stuff, but I definitely have a list. But the Caribbean is probably where I've done most of my diving.
All right, Justin, if some of the students, some of the people tuning in today want to dive a little deeper into your work, where should they go?
They can check me out on Running Wild Media. That's the name of our production company. We have all kinds of exciting stuff there. We're active on social media, so whatever you guys use, Facebook, Instagram, or just the website, just search Running Wild Media. You can find all of our information there, as well as check out Hakai magazine in the next few weeks to see a short film about all of the work that Luiz has been doing between the Marshall Islands and Fernando de Noronha.
All right, and Luiz, same question for you. Where should we go to follow some of your work, some of your adventures?
I'm also easy to find at the Khan Academy websites. That's khanacademy.org. I'm on social media. I post a lot of my underwater pictures, like just in my degrees in science, but I love photography, and I've done a lot of photography on the side. So every time I take something interesting photos, I try to share them on social media. I am coral reef fish, both in Twitter and Instagram. I know the young crowd doesn't like Twitter too much, but I'm on Instagram also, and I share my pictures on both of them under the handle of Coral Reef Fish.
All right, perfect. Well, a huge shout out to all the groups who joined us from across North America today, to the educators, to the students, to the families. So great to have everybody learning in these challenging times here together. And then a huge shout out again to Justin and Luiz. Thank you so much for the work you're doing and sharing it with us today.
Yeah, it's great being here and talking to you guys.
Fantastic. Thanks for having us.
Perfect. Last thing I'll do is I'm going to unmute the mic. So anybody who is tuning in, give us a big goodbye and thank you before we come out today. Here we go.
Hi,
Thank you. Goodbye.
everybody. That was awesome.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. We are going to sign off.